assume.
Mr. Commissioner, Ms. Tesaro will be leading the next witness, Dave Carter. So I'll simply pass over to her. I'm going to continue to wear the hat of timekeeper for today's purpose.
Morning, Mr. Commissioner. In addition to Mr. Martland, we also have Micah Carmody here today with me. Today we'll be having some more focused evidence on the topic of habitat monitoring by DFO. And I'm going to aim to complete our examination of Mr. Carter before the morning break. And Mr. Bizet, on occasion I'll be referring to our habitat management PPR, so if you could just generally have that document at hand, that would be appreciated. And also, Mr. Bizet, could I ask you to pull up Mr. Carter's CV? And before we get into that,
You solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Would you state your full name, please?
My name is David William Carter.
Thank you, sir. Counsel?
now, Mr. Carter, you'll see that there's a curriculum vitae on the screen before you. Is that yours?
Yes, it is.
Could I have that marked as the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit number 671.
I'm going to ask you some very long and leading questions about your background, and if there's any detail in what I say that you feel needs correcting or clarifying, I'll ask you to do that.
All right.
And I think you'll be aware of this process because,
Counsel, that should be 672
thank you.
for the exhibit. Thank you.
I think you'll be aware of this process because you were here on Monday for the Habitat Management Panel's evidence and watched us zip through credentials then.
That's correct.
So you obtained an Honours Bachelor of Science degree in zoology from the University of British Columbia in 1986, and then went on to obtain a Master's of Science in Biology with a specific focus on habitat analysis from Simon Fraser University in 1990.
That's correct.
And then between 1990 and 1996, you taught biology at both UBC and SFU. And in 1996, you left academia and joined DFO as a senior habitat biologist with the Oceans Habitat and Enhancement Branch. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Working for DFO for the next 9 years.
Correct.
In 2005, you left DFO to take a position as senior program officer with the SIA agency in its regional office here in Vancouver.
Correct.
Oh, I should note for the record that SIA agency is the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency.
Yes.
And you returned to DFO in 2008 to commence your current role as Regional Team Leader, Habitat Monitoring, which is a position based in regional headquarters here in Vancouver.
Yes.
Do you recall what month in 2008?
November. November the 11th, actually.
Okay, an easy date to remember. So you've been in the role of Regional Habitat Monitoring Lead then for almost 2.5 years.
Correct.
So the Habitat Monitoring Unit is the unit that you oversee, and could you explain how it's situated within OHEB, within the Oceans Habitat and Enhancement Branch?
The Habitat Monitoring Unit is structured much like the rest of the Habitat Management Program in Pacific Region, where there's a regional headquarters and then there are area offices. And it's, as Rebecca referred to it, a matrix model of direct and functional reporting. So I have some monitoring staff in regional headquarters that report directly to me. There are monitoring staff, monitoring biologists, and monitoring technicians in each of the areas, and they report to me functionally with regards to monitoring. And there are 12 individuals in the Habitat Monitoring Unit.
And just to be clear, the fact that you have 12 staff in the Habitat Monitoring Unit, that's not exhaustive of all the biologists or habitat staff in DFO OHEB who would be doing habitat monitoring.
That's correct. The monitoring unit their time is dedicated to monitoring. Habitat staff in general, there's been, I guess, a goal of setting 20% of their effort towards monitoring. So we would have a role in coordinating those efforts as well.
And as the regional monitoring lead and the lead of the HMU, could you just very briefly summarize your primary duties?
I guess my primary duties are to oversee the, implementation and operation of habitat monitoring in the Pacific region. So developing a plan for doing monitoring within the region, setting work plans. I also act on a national working group with my colleagues who are regional team leads across the country, working on developing national standards and a national implementation of monitoring as well.
Do you currently have responsibility for any of the other elements of what is known as DFO's Habitat Compliance Modernization, or HCM initiative?
Well, the HCM, or the Habitat Compliance Modernization, has 3 elements. There's the protocol, which is the agreement between Habitat and CMP. There is the compliance decision framework, which is the policy document that lays out how we will evaluate and respond to incidents of non-compliance. And then there's the monitoring component. My main role is in the monitoring component. However, I'm also the regional trainer on the Habitat Compliance Decision Framework, as well as I have been involved in, facilitating the development of the regional and area operational plans, or for the protocol of the agreement between CMP and Habitat.
And on that last point of the regional and area operational plans, are you currently engaged in any drafting or redrafting efforts?
The national protocol between CMP and Habitat has been revised. There have been some meetings with regards to development of a revised regional protocol, but at this point there's been no redrafting done.
Thanks. Mr. Visit, could I ask that you pull up tab 7 of Canada's list of documents? And if you could just, there you go. Mr. Carter, are you familiar with this document?
Yes, I am. I actually wrote it.
And who was it presented to, and for what purpose?
This PowerPoint presentation was developed spring of 2010, and it was presented to the Regional Management Committee. Now, that would be the Habitat Management Committee, which comprised the regional manager of Habitat, as well as the area managers for Habitat. And it was presented, in advance of our field season, and it sort of laid out the structure of HCM and talked about some of our sort of objectives for that year.
Could I have this marked as the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit 673.
And could we turn to page 5? Could you turn to page 5? Just to confirm, Mr. Carter, this is the, governance structure that you explained a few moments ago?
Or this would be the organizational chart for the Habitat Monitoring Unit, where the solid lines would be direct line reporting, and then the dashed lines would be functional reporting.
You mentioned that you have a few other staff in regional headquarters who, outside of the area monitoring coordinators, you have a few line staff who also report to you. They're not shown on this. Could you just indicate who they are and what they do?
Yes. I have 2 other staff that report to me. One is an inventory biologist, and the other is the regional coordinator for the PATH, the Program Activity Tracking System.
Thank you. You've also mentioned that you have, as shown here, 12 HMU staff. My question is, when did the HMU get fully staffed?
It would have been the spring, summer following when I came onto the department. So I think the unit was about 50% staffed when I arrived in November. The rest of the staffing occurred sort of spring, summer of 2009.
HCM, the Habitat Compliance Modernization Initiative, was introduced in 2005, and you've said that habitat monitoring is the 3rd element of that. I'm wondering why it took so long to staff the HMU.
Actually, I think HCM was included or added to the EPMP initiative in 2006, I think, as the 6th element. There was a document in 2005 sort of, proposing a habitat monitoring initiative, but the actual addition to the EPMP was in 2006, I believe. Subsequent to that, are you asking sort of why it took so long? Yes.
That's the question.
Part of that had to do with there were other staffing changes going on at that time from 2007 onward. There also needed to be the development of, I guess, staffing plans, and then those staffing plans needed to be approved, positions needed to be created, and then the staffing processes needed to occur. I wasn't actually here for those various activities, but that's my understanding. To this point, we have had a minor number of staff turnovers. Technicians have changed, but we haven't had any difficulties with staffing those positions.
And pardon me if you've already explained this, but who is the manager within regional headquarters
That I report directly to?
Right.
I report to an acting manager currently, Brad Fanos, who is the acting regional manager for Habitat.
And the final question I have around organizational structure is, do you have a reporting relationship with national headquarters?
I do. I guess I have a functional reporting relationship with Chad Zia, who is in the operations side in NHQ.
And has he always been the person that you've functionally reported to in the last 2.5 years, or have there been other individuals?
No, prior to Chad, there was Daria Langell. So I think Daria was in place for about 12 months, and then Chad has been in place subsequent.
And you mentioned that there's a National Habitat Monitoring Working Group that you sit on. How many times has that group met approximately in the last 2.5 years? Is it routine? Is it annual?
Approximately twice a year. And then there's been conference calls, which sort of, again, 2 a year of those conference calls as well.
Turning more now to the genesis of the Habitat Monitoring Unit, if you could turn to the next page of this deck. I'm only using the page of this deck because of the heading. Strengthen HMP's capacity to monitor. Is that, in essence, the focus of HMU?
Very much so. You know, again, back to the HCM initiative, those 3 elements, the third of which was increasing the habitat management program's ability to do monitoring and to put more effort towards that monitoring. So yes, the genesis of the Habitat Monitoring Unit in this region would be a response to that.
Are there other developments in the last decade or two that strengthening monitoring capacity in the region has been responsive to?
Yes, I guess there's been a number of things that have led to a desire to increase monitoring, or recognizing that doing more monitoring would be worthwhile. First of all, there was a survey done in 2005 prior to the development of the report that we alluded to earlier, which looked at sort of monitoring efforts nationally. There was also work done by Quigley and Harper looking at sort of rates of compliance associated with various projects, making recommendations about doing more compliance monitoring. There were the Auditor General's reports suggesting that more monitoring would be a good thing to do. So there have been a number of things that have led to this genesis.
On that latter point of the Auditor General's monitoring reports, are you including, I imagine, the 2009 Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development report?
Yes.
And are you also including the 2004 Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development report, which was in the specific context of Pacific salmon habitat?
Yes.
Thank you. So just looking at this page here a little more closely, there is a line, I believe, that is very faint on our version because I believe it was a color deck. And I'm wondering if you're able to fill in the blank of what that line reads from your more legible paper copy.
Yes. A lesson learned about not using light green in a PowerPoint. I do believe it says, I think it says monitoring, and then it talks about compliance monitoring. Underneath in the second line, compliance monitoring, effectiveness monitoring, and occurrence tracking.
And is there a percentage assigned to monitoring?
20%. Now, to be clear, that is a goal that was set by managers in Pacific Region for the habitat program in this region.
Were you one of the managers who set that goal?
No, this occurred before I showed up.
Okay. Are you familiar, are you aware if that is the same target for the percentage nationally?
To be honest, I can't say for sure. I've heard discussions about setting something, but I haven't seen something set out like this.
And do these percentages, you've said they're goals, are they in terms of staff time? Is that what the percentage reflects?
Staff time or effort.
Okay.
Yeah.
And over the time that you've been here, in the last 2.5 years in this position, what approximately is the percentage of staff time that is actually spent on monitoring, according to your best information?
There have been a couple of regional surveys done where we've gone and asked staff about the time that they've spent involved in monitoring. Best estimates and observations would be, more along the lines of 5%.
And just turning very quickly to the bullet that reads policy and science, 5%. Within that 5%, do you know what portion is targeted for the wild salmon policy and what that wild salmon policy refers to there?
Well, I do know what wild salmon policy refers to. In terms of that 5%, I would be hard pressed. I don't know that it applies to every habitat staff. I think it might be, directed more specifically at key individuals who are involved in those things. Mostly, though, there are staff in areas who have been involved in, supporting the development of status reports and other things. So there has been some area involvement in things like the wild salmon policy and in engagement with science as well.
Okay. Before we turn to explaining the three basic types of habitat monitoring, I'm hoping you can just make this discussion a little bit more concrete. What purposes do we monitor fish habitat for? Why monitor fish habitat? What objectives does that serve from the perspective of sustainability of salmon?
There's a number of really good reasons, or very good reasons, to do monitoring. First of all, to support, compliance and manage compliance to ensure that when we do provide conditions or advice, that those conditions or that advice is adhered to. I think it's often beneficial that when people expect you to show up, there is an incentive to be compliant. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason would be to, continuously shoot for improvement, to measure performance and evaluate how effective we're being. And, based on the information we gather, look to ways that we could become more effective or improve how we're doing. So there's an element of performance measurement as well.
This might be an obvious question, but can you identify the link, if there is one, between monitoring activities and the principle of no net loss of productive capacity of fish habitat? How do those things relate to each other?
Well, one of the things with monitoring is we are looking at, compliance. And compliance to the Act has a lot to do with whether there's an unauthorized harmful alteration to the habitat occurring. That compliance, if we are quantifying how frequently those unauthorized harms to habitat are happening, that does give us a window into the impacts that are occurring to fish habitat.
Apart from compliance, though, is monitoring not also relevant to assessing the effectiveness of your of the advice you give aimed at achieving no net loss? Sorry to be so leading, but I'm hoping you can explain that a bit.
Yes, it is. We can use this monitoring to evaluate the quality of the advice. First of all, we can look to see whether somebody did follow the advice, and if they did follow the advice, then we can evaluate whether it avoided impacts or not. And
just to make this a little bit more concrete, we heard yesterday or the day before about the example of Shuswap Lake. I'm trying to find a Fraser River sockeye specific example. Can you provide the Commissioner an example of the types of projects or activities on, say, Shuswap Lake that might be monitored, and the types more generally of fish habitat that OHEB staff are monitoring?
Right. Now the SLIP program, or the monitoring that was done on Shuswap Lake, was a program that some of the monitoring staff were involved in. They did some shoreline inventory work, They also looked at development activities along the shoreline and identified those and mapped those. So development of docks, shoreline modifications, walls, encroachment, boat launches, all of those various projects were inventoried.
Apart from SLIP, perhaps, just in a very basic way, assuming I'm a high school student, what are the kinds of projects, you've mentioned some docks, foreshore development,
Right.
that your staff monitor, and in what types of Fraser River sockeye habitats across the province?
Okay. In terms of how we conducted monitoring, we based our monitoring on the regulatory tools that the department uses. So we looked at projects that were dealt with through authorizations, projects that were dealt with through letters of advice, and projects that were dealt with through operational statements. Those various regulatory tools were used on a broad range of projects, both in the marine environment and the freshwater environment. Everything from, stream crossings, bridges, through docks, through log dumps, port developments, a very broad range of project types.
And this would obviously include monitoring in areas like Georgia Strait,
Yes.
Queen Charlotte Strait.
I'd have to look to see where projects were monitored, but potentially yes.
Is there a geographic endpoint where OHAB stops monitoring?
No, we looked at throughout the entire region, so there was monitoring conducted throughout the region.
And thank you. And from your perspective, within the Habitat Monitoring Unit, is habitat monitoring less relevant or less important for Fraser River sockeye than it is for other salmon populations or other fish species?
Less relevant. I think that fish are dependent upon habitat, so I think in all of them there's relevance. Different species have different levels of dependence on freshwater habitat versus marine, those sorts of things. So I think the relevance might change depending on which fish stock and which life history you're talking about, but I think it's relevant for all of them.
Thank you. And I'm hoping we can turn to the PPR now, which I believe is PPR number 8. And Mr. Visit, it's page 74, which I think is PDF page 79. Mr. Carter, I'm referring you to the PPR because I'm hoping it'll be an efficient tool to get in some evidence about the 3 general types of habitat monitoring contemplated by the Habitat Management Program.
Yes.
Looking at paragraph 87 on the previous page, sorry. Have you had an opportunity to read this?
Yes, I have.
And do you agree with the general descriptions of compliance monitoring, effectiveness monitoring, ecosystem monitoring, and do you have anything to add to those descriptions?
I would agree with those descriptions. I don't think I have anything to add.
On the last one of ecosystem or fish habitat health monitoring, we see a lot of different names for this type of monitoring.
Yes.
For the sake of the record, I'm going to rattle off some of those type of names, and you're
Sure.
going to, I hope, tell me if any of them are not, in fact, akin to each other. So we hear fish habitat health monitoring,
Yes.
environmental monitoring.
I wouldn't lump that in there because environmental monitoring is often aimed at project monitoring.
Okay, thank you. Aquatic health monitoring,
I think that would fall in that category.
and again, ecosystem monitoring.
Yes.
And in the context of the wild salmon policy, these types of monitorings are basically monitoring CU habitat status. That's the nomenclature of the wild salmon policy.
By seeing, you're talking about conservation units and the status of conservation units?
And the status of their habitats.
Yes.
So that would effectively be akin to Strategy 2 monitoring.
Yes.
Thank you. You were here on Monday and Tuesday, and did you hear Mr. LeBlanc refer to the compliance monitoring unit?
I don't recall him referring to it, but he probably did. Yeah.
Well, I'll ask another way, sorry. Is the habitat monitoring unit described here in the Pacific region using that particular label?
No, we generally refer to it as the habitat monitoring unit.
Do you think it's fair to say that the that national perspective is more heavily focused on compliance monitoring than the regional perspective is?
I think nationally there's a recognition that it's going to be a sort of a stepwise rollout of monitoring, and that, you know, initially there's a focus on compliance monitoring, but there's an expectation that there will be development of effectiveness or efficacy monitoring as well as fish habitat health monitoring, but that will come with time.
Wrapping up a little bit on compliance monitoring, can compliance monitoring serve as a surrogate or a proxy for assessing whether there's been a loss or gain in the productive capacity of fish habitat? Is it suited to that task?
As a surrogate, it would not be a particularly strong surrogate. When you ask general questions, you get general answers, and that doesn't necessarily tell you a lot. By going out and identifying whether a particular project is compliant or non-compliant as a yes/no, that doesn't tell you how much of an impact it may have caused. So that next level of monitoring where you evaluate the level of impact is important as well.
And when you say compliance, just to be really clear about nomenclature here, sometimes I hear compliance monitoring described as evaluating conformity, and sometimes I hear it described as evaluating compliance. Are those the same things? Can you explain those concepts?
No, they're actually fairly distinct concepts. Conformity has to do with evaluating whether somebody followed the advice or followed the conditions that you provided them through our regulatory tools. And that would be conformity. Compliance would be whether they are, I guess, compliant with the legislation. So, and in most cases, we're looking at Section 35 of the legislation. Did they or did they not cause an unauthorized, harmful alteration or destruction of habitat?
So a proponent could not conform with DFO's advice, but that doesn't automatically mean that there is a so-called compliance issue.
That's exactly correct.
Okay. From the perspective of
the
DFO.
alternative too is they could conform to our advice and end up non-compliant.
And would DFO deem that situation a compliance issue?
It would be a compliance issue, but it might have more to say about the quality of our advice.
Thanks. There's a couple of field forms that you use, and this may assist in demonstrating just what it is that is monitored in the field by HMU monitors and others. And if, Mr. Bizzett, if you could pull up tabs 2 and 4 of our list, and if it's possible to put them side by side. And Mr. Carter, you have them in your binder there too if you need them.
These would, tab 4?
Tabs 2 and tabs 4. Could you just very briefly explain, if you're able to, what these two documents are?
These are the field monitoring forms that the Habitat Monitoring Unit uses when we do a site visit. It lays out sort of the tombstone or general information about the project, where it's located, what the coordinates of it are, who was the proponent, what was the water body involved. And then it goes through in the lower section the national questions regarding compliance monitoring.
When you say the lower section, do you mean page 2 of tab 2?
Oh, sorry. I'm looking at the document on the left.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, so this would be the field form, and then the document on the right is our answer guide for that field form.
And were you involved in creating these two documents?
Yes, I was.
Could we have tab 2 marked as the next exhibit, and that will be described as the Pacific Region Marine Compliance Monitoring Site Visit Form?
Exhibit number 674.
And then could we also have tab 4 marked as the next exhibit, and that can be described as the answer guide for the Pacific Region Monitoring Form?
675.
If we could, Mr. Bizzett, just turn back to the first page of the Marine Site Visit Form, tab 2, page 1. Thank you. Mr. Carter, can you comment on question number 6?
Were the mitigation measures effective in preventing negative impacts to fish habitat?
Does that begin to get into effectiveness monitoring? Do aspects of this form begin to...
There's the beginnings of it, but again, it would be almost at a physical level of evaluation. You know, were there impacts caused, but not at an ecosystem sort of response to it. This question, though, one of the things you'll see from the answer guide is we had to interpret these questions very specifically in order to ensure that they were answered consistently. So for that particular question 6, we only answered that question in relation to mitigation measures that were properly installed. So if we went there, identified a mitigation measure that was correctly installed, then we evaluated whether it was successful in preventing the negative effects or not.
So is it fair for me to say that, you know, the department's really only at the beginning stages of conducting effectiveness monitoring in the Pacific region?
That would be correct.
Okay. Again, here I'm just paraphrasing, and if need be, we can find the transcript reference, but you were here. On Monday, Mr. LeBlanc suggested a few times that before DFO Habitat staff could really do effectiveness monitoring, that DFO would need to devise a methodology, that it would need to go through peer review. Do you recall that?
I do recall mention of that.
And by methodology, I simply understand that term to mean, you know, what do you monitor and how? Is that a fair basic description of effectiveness methodology? We're looking at what do you monitor to gauge effectiveness, and how do you...
And how do you conduct that monitoring, yes.
And isn't that quite well established? Aren't there already effectiveness monitoring methodologies that you would have studied in university? Isn't this something that DFO knows how to do?
There are field protocols out there for capturing different types of habitat variables. There are standards out there, and we, you know, this year will be using some of those standards or evaluating some of those standards to see how applicable and how well they work with, you know, some of the monitoring that we're doing. But, you know, to develop a monitoring plan associated with any particular project, different projects have different types of impacts that might affect different elements of the environment, and you do need to develop your monitoring plan in relation to what the potential impacts of the project might be.
Are you aware if, as part of the Quigley-Harper evaluation in the mid-2000s, effectiveness monitoring methodologies were considered as part of that?
They were, and you know, I guess one of the recommended methodologies was a before-after control impact sort of methodology, where you would establish control sites prior to the impact and then evaluate your impact site versus those control sites. So yes, I'm aware of those.
And my next question goes to a question that actually Mr. Harrison asked a couple of days ago, and that's in evaluating before, after, and control sites, to really do effectiveness monitoring, how important is it that you have that baseline information?
That pre-information or that inventory information, it's fairly key. There's, you know, and then at a number of different levels. There's broad or general inventory information about a watershed. There's also more specific baseline information in relation to a particular project. Right. What type of habitat was at that site prior to the project? And that's useful information as well.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else that briefly we should understand about DFO's effectiveness monitoring efforts before we quickly look at ecosystem monitoring?
I guess the only thing would be the BACI methodology is one form of monitoring that could be applied. There are other forms of effectiveness monitoring, such as a reference state approach, where you would, you know, have a general condition or model that you monitored against. So there are a number of different ways that you could approach this effectiveness monitoring.
Okay, thank you. In terms of this third type of monitoring, let's call it fish habitat health monitoring or ecosystem monitoring. Is this currently being done by OHEB staff?
I guess there are circumstances where inventory or baseline information is being captured. Habitat monitoring staff were involved in the Shuswap inventory work that was done. Similar work is being proposed for Lake Els on the north coast. Work was done on the Cowichan on the island. There's a number of places where habitat staff are collecting inventory information. And that's part of that ecosystem evaluation, what's there currently. Then there's the other element of sort of what is the status or how healthy is it? And there's some work being done under WSP. There are some status reports, whether you want to call them first versions or pilots, that have been done in the region.
Am I right, though, that neither of those two types of activities that you described are currently part of the HCM, Habitat Compliance Modernization Initiative?
I guess they're not currently included in our work plan as active monitoring projects. There is some effort being put towards developing tools or methods, but there isn't any current sort of habitat status monitoring being done other than the inventory work that I already mentioned.
Right. There's a very quick visual synopsis of what I think you just described at page 7 of Exhibit 204. I'm going to ask you if this information in this deck is accurate. I should ask, have you seen this document before?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so looking at page 7, at the top there under the heading WSP Disconnect with HMP, you've got WSP in one box and EPMP, and in particular Habitat Compliance Modernization in another. Does that describe the state of affairs currently?
In terms of the work plans, I would say that it does. I mean, WSP is looking at, environmental monitoring based on the watershed, on the status of the watershed. Under Habitat Compliance Modernization, we're mainly looking at project-by-project monitoring. However, the Habitat Compliance unit, we have had some involvement in WSP. I have been working with some of the folks working under Strategy 2, looking at developing a monitoring framework for Strategy 2. So I have been engaged in that development, and that work is currently ongoing. So again, building foundations.
We might return to that if I have time, but just very quickly, are HMU monitoring coordinates and monitoring technicians currently using the Strategy 2 habitat indicators that were...
No, they are not.
Okay. Maybe more importantly, could they? Would habitat monitoring staff, including in your unit and in OHAB generally, have the ability to monitor some of those Strategy 2 habitat indicators?
Some of those physical status indicators, things like temperature, turbidity, yes, we could. And I think the vision is that sometime in the future we likely would be.
What about things like TSS or dissolved oxygen, water quality parameters? Do you have the ability to would you in the future have the ability potentially to monitor those?
Yes, we would. Capacity would be another issue.
Right. And we've heard evidence on that. I'm wondering if anyone has, apart from the work you're doing on assisting in the development of a monitoring framework under Strategy 2, have you ever been asked by any regional or national managers to incorporate WSP habitat monitoring into the work of the habitat monitoring unit?
I've had it identified to me in the region that it's likely, would be desirable if we would, and that, it's something that would be a future development. It hasn't come up at the national level, though there has been recent work at the national level looking at a more ecosystem-based approach, much of which sounds very familiar to some of the strategies within WSP. So I think there is a shift at the national level as well.
Do you recall the WSP ever being raised in a meeting with national DFO officials in the context of habitat monitoring?
I guess I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago in Montreal, and that had to do with a meeting between science and habitat, but previously, no.
Could you bring up tab 15 of our list, Mr. Bissett? I'm wondering if this might be in relation to the meeting. Mr. Carter, is this a document that came out of the meeting a couple of weeks ago?
No, this was a document that would have come out of a meeting in December, and this would have been a meeting of that national working group of team leaders in monitoring, and this was a framework document that was provided from national to the team leaders, and it just sort of outlines, I guess, goals and objectives and a path forward for monitoring nationally.
Could we have this marked as the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit number 676.
And could we turn to the second page of this document? So here we see that nomenclature issue again. We've got something identified in this schematic as you see compliance monitoring, then you see effectiveness monitoring, and then you see a large pink box that has within it a smaller box called effects monitoring. Is that the same thing that we're talking about, ecosystem monitoring, fish habitat health monitoring?
My understanding would be yes, it is.
And it is unclear to me from looking at this document who is contemplated to be the lead on that kind of fish habitat health monitoring.
I think my understanding from this that the lead in terms of developing the methodology would be science. But you can see from the sort of pointing at the screen here that you can't see, the blue dashed line,
right,
that outlines sort of the role of Habitat, which would include the monitoring staff, and that we would have a role in those various elements. And you can see there's a smaller box with Habitat in the effects monitoring or that ecosystem health monitoring. So I think there's a role envisioned for Habitat.
Just going back to 2005 and the genesis of HCM, without questioning whether or not science should or shouldn't have a role, was it not originally contemplated that Habitat through the HCM would be the lead on habitat on fish habitat health monitoring?
I'm not sure, to be honest, in terms of what the expectation was. I would think there would have been an expectation that science would be engaged.
Thanks. This may be a stupid question, but is one type of these three types of habitat monitoring, in your perspective as someone who does habitat monitoring work, more important or more fundamental for ensuring the sustainability of Pacific salmon and specifically Fraser River sockeye salmon?
To be honest, I think they're interdependent. In terms of sort of compliance monitoring, you need to, if you're going to improve your methodology, you need to go out and find out whether somebody followed your advice. And then once you've done that, then you need to evaluate whether that advice led to the outcome that you wanted and with regard to that specific project. And then you need to take the next step of evaluating and how did the environment respond to that as well. So I think all three of them are interdependent. I wouldn't necessarily suggest that any one was more critical than the other.
Thanks. I'm turning now to the issue of National Habitat Monitoring Framework and the Regional Habitat Monitoring Framework. And while Mr. Bissett is finding tab 1, specifically the draft National Habitat Monitoring Framework within tab 1 of our documents, I'll ask you, Mr. Carter, can you explain the status, I suppose, of the National Habitat Monitoring Framework at DFO and what's been done with that framework?
Well, the diagram or the figure that you showed previously, that, in my understanding, is the draft national framework that outlines kind of the approach, and I think it was titled as a framework.
Okay.
So,
you're talking about the last document we looked at, Exhibit
yes.
676, for the record?
Yes. There was some discussion of creating a more fulsome sort of a framework document at the national level. However, I do not know that has how far that has progressed.
In terms of the document that's on the screen, do you use this document? Does it provide guidance? What do you understand to be this document's purpose?
Yes, we use this document on a very regular basis. Sorry. You're looking at the 2005 National Habitat Monitoring Framework. We use this document as a bit of a guide for the development of a regional document.
In terms of the National Habitat Monitoring Framework on the screen, do you understand, it's dated, it says draft December 15th, 2005.
Right.
Do you understand this to have been finalized since 2005?
No, that's not my understanding. So. Sorry, I may have been a bit confusing there for a moment. Yeah, sorry, this is the early document that was developed in 2005 prior to the implementation of HCM.
Right.
This document was sort of a proposal or a suggestion as to how things could go. Subsequent to that, this document has not been revised. The other document we were talking about previously, the picture,
Right.
it also has been referred to as a framework. I think it's
Okay.
titled as a framework. Sorry for the confusion. But it does lay out sort of a set of objectives and an approach.
Is there any formal guidance from the National Habitat Monitoring Program offered to the regions on how to conduct habitat monitoring operationally?
Operationally, there was the previous document that we looked at, those sort of goals and objectives. There has been some work done. If you look at the PATH system, the program activity system, there is some guidance with regards to answering of those compliance questions that is captured there, and that was developed at a national level with input from regions. Beyond that, in terms of how to implement a regional sort of monitoring initiative, there's been a tremendous amount of flexibility offered. The reality is monitoring as a regional initiative is being rolled out in somewhat different fashions in the different regions. So,
We're going to turn to the regional approach in a moment, but first I should probably mark this document here, the National Habitat Monitoring Framework Draft, December 15th, 2005 is the next exhibit.
We're to 677.
Would DFO benefit from a National Habitat Monitoring Framework?
I guess there's pros and cons to that, and it's always the pull between national level direction versus regional flexibility. So a certain amount of national direction would be useful and would be helpful, but the reality is at the regional level, often you need to be able to tailor your program to your specific circumstances. So being overly prescriptive could make things difficult.
So turning then to the regional approach, Mr. Bissett, this is tab 18 of the Commission's documents. Mr. Carter, you're familiar with this document?
I am familiar with this document.
And did you draft it?
I did.
And is this Pacific Region Habitat Monitoring Framework finalized in the region?
It is very close to final. Regionally, we held a workshop with all of the monitoring staff as well as all of the area managers and the regional managers running through this document in order to ensure everybody's understanding was the same. And there was a general consensus towards the content of this document. It has been revised moderately, but only to make the statements a little bit bolder and to make it more concise.
Has it gone to the Regional Management Committee yet?
It has not.
It has?
It has not.
Okay.
Well, excuse me, I should say, the Regional Managers Committee was the committee that provided the direction on making it bolder, making it more concise. So they have seen this document, obviously.
I think we might be talking about different things. When you say the Regional Managers Committee, you're talking about within OHEB.
Yes.
It hasn't yet gone to the
Greg Savard.
Operations Committee. I'm getting things wrong,
Yes.
sir.
No, it has not.
Okay. And maybe just if you could describe very generally the purposes of your Pacific Region Habitat Monitoring Framework, what it's intended to achieve, what it's intended to guide.
A number of things. It lays out goals, objectives, governance, basically how we would go about doing monitoring in this region and why we would do that monitoring. So it talks about our development of priorities, our work planning, our timing during the year, who would be involved, what our linkages with the rest of the program would be. So it really does lay out how we would do monitoring in this region.
Does it differ in any material way from the draft National Monitoring Framework?
The 2005 document?
Right.
Not in any dramatic fashion that I can think of, because we did use that 2005 document as a guide. So,
does it envision a different role for science, for DFO science and DFO habitat management program, or does it?
I think the regional document assumes an engagement with science, perhaps that wasn't necessarily identified in the 2005 document, but is identified in the regional document.
Okay.
So.
I know that a lot of work's gone into this, and I'm sorry to skip over it, but if I could just mark it as the next exhibit and move on to the 2010 field season. So my understanding is that 2010 was the very first complete full field season conducted by the HMU.
Yes.
And I will take you to a couple of documents that we've received recently to pin some of your results down, but maybe before we do that, could you just describe, in summary, what were the results of the 2010 field season? What were some of the observations that were made?
All right. I would say that this field season was very much a learning opportunity. There were a number of observations made, observations that we will take to try and improve the monitoring that we do in the future, or to enhance the monitoring we do in the future. We identified a number of issues, some of which were sort of outstanding issues. The availability of information to do monitoring upon was identified as an issue. Sometimes how carefully conditions are worded as to whether those conditions are measurable or not was identified. So, some recommendations with regards to clarity and wording of conditions, and that those conditions include measurable sort of indicators of success. So there were a number of things that we learned. I think we learned that, from the compliance side, like I said before, when you ask general questions, you get general answers.
Right.
We also learned that there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to the impact evaluation side of it, to ensure that there's consistency in how those impacts are quantified and how they're measured or estimated, so that it can be done consistently across the region.
Just to follow up on one thing you just said, you mentioned the necessity, I think, for clear authorizations, that was a...
Clear conditions.
Clear conditions. And you're talking about conditions there in Section 35 authorizations? Authorizations
or advice provided in letters of advice, or even conditions included in operational statements.
And is that because if the advice that's given isn't clear, then you can't actually monitor and assess whether or not it was conformed with?
Whether somebody successfully met that condition.
Okay.
I can pose a good example.
Sure.
I mean, we ran into a lot of circumstances where a particular condition said, minimize this effect, or, minimize the amount of riparian clearing. Well, from a monitoring perspective, it's difficult to determine what was the minimum that should have been met. So.
And that problem of the need for advice to be measurable, is that a recent observation that DFO has learned, or is that is that problem been recognized for some time?
I think there's a balance between trying not to be overly prescriptive and give proponents opportunities to come up with creative solutions to issues, versus being prescriptive, and including very measurable sort of outcomes. So it's been seen as an issue to be balanced, but with the onset of doing more dedicated monitoring, especially from the monitoring unit's perspective, it's been identified as a fairly key issue.
And this is largely to get these documents on the record, but if we could pull up tab 16. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
And did you create this?
Yes, I did.
And it was presented to whom and for what purpose?
Again, it would have been presented to the Habitat Managers Committee, which would have been the regional manager of Habitat as well as the area managers.
And could we mark this as the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit 679.
And could we turn to page 6 very quickly?
Actually, can I just... this presentation was provided in November,
right
at this sort of as the field season was beginning to wrap up. But in terms of data entry and other things, there was still a lot of data going into the database. So this was very preliminary sort of update on how the field season went.
And I think if we turn to page 6, thank you. Very preliminary results.
Yes.
I just want to understand one thing about this table that I don't understand. You've got conformed to advice, you may have addressed this already, but conformed to advice 36 sites, is that right?
Yeah, well, okay, yes.
That seems...
And that's actually a percentage, 36%.
36%.
Now, that, to be clear though, that answer to that question, there were a number of possible answers. There was a yes, a no, a partial, or a not applicable.
So roughly half of the sites that you monitored had partial conformity to DFO's advice.
Exactly. So, you know, in terms of total conformity to advice, 36 partial. If you combined partial with total, you're up somewhere around, I think, almost 80%.
How would you assess that rate? Is that good? Is that expected? Is that surprising?
Not surprising. I think, you know, partial conformance to advice was expected.
Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead. If we could just really quickly go to page 8. Whoa. Now, I think this is the point that you were making already about the need for authorizations to be clear and measurable.
Yes.
So turning to page 9 then. We've got a second observation here about a lack of consistency in DFO and proponent documents. And my question is actually about one of the blue comments at the bottom. ROS were easy. Regional operational statements?
Yes.
And why were they easy?
Regional operations statements were relatively easy to monitor because the conditions were specific and they were the same because we were looking at one type of project. So you had a set of conditions that you could go out and evaluate against. The point above had to do with the fact that, especially with authorizations where you've got our authorization document where you may include, there may be a series of conditions included. Mm-hmm. You would also have proponent documents and plans that might include a series of, I guess, commitments. And sometimes there was difficulty because the commitments that the proponent was making versus the conditions that were included in the DFO document didn't line up, or in some cases weren't even compatible. It was also sometimes very difficult to know when a particular condition was in play. Was that a condition that applied to construction, or was that a condition that applied post-construction? So the clarity of the regional operational statements, one type of project, one set of conditions, made the monitoring of those projects relatively simple. So I guess, you know, the observation or the recommendation that sort of came out of here was we need to see about trying to be more consistent in how we format and pose those conditions.
Thank you. And just turning to the final observation in this deck, which is the next page. File management data entry is still a problem. Too much time had to be allocated to finding the information necessary to conduct monitoring, and in many cases it limited the number of projects that could be monitored. Is this a surprising observation or one that you expected?
No, I mean, as it's come out previously, you know, the observations from Quigley and Harper and others, you know, there was an expectation at the Auditor General reports as well that records management is a difficult issue and that, you know, there are, I guess, issues, and you know what we were pointing out is that records management also had implications on the effectiveness and the monitoring capacity. So.
You just mentioned the Commissioner's report. You're talking about 2009?
Yes.
Do you know, since that report, what has been done to bring more rigor, if I could dare use that word, more rigor to national file management protocols?
I mean, I know there's been work done on the PATH, the Program Activity Tracking System, to try and make it, you know, more user-friendly, to increase the capacity. I know there's been a lot of capacity added to the system in terms of uploading of documents so that those documents can be available electronically. So there has been work done to our tracking system to help support that. However, it hasn't addressed all of the issues.
I'll read you the very specific recommendation and response from the 2009 report without taking you there because I have about 15 minutes left here.
Sure.
So the recommendation, and for the record, this is Exhibit 35, ringtail page 16, and if Mr. Bizet has time to pull that up, that would be great. The recommendation is, in order to make consistent decisions on project referrals in accordance with departmental expectations, Fisheries and Oceans Canada should ensure that an appropriate risk-based quality assurance system is in place for the review of these decisions. And then DFO's response in part is as follows. Although much progress has been made, the department recognizes that there is still much work to be done with respect to documentation standards. With that in mind, by 31st of March 2010, DFO will implement a risk-based quality assurance system to verify that documentation standards are being applied consistently by staff. Are you aware of any such implementation of a new risk-based quality assurance system to verify documentation standards?
I'm sorry, I'm not.
Regionally, however, I understand that there's been some effort made through your unit to come up with file management protocols. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, out of monitoring, I guess there were a number of documents that were identified as being fairly key to allow monitoring to occur. And to support monitoring, things like project designs, the set of conditions, the commitments from the proponent, those necessary documents were identified. In one of the areas, in the South Coast area, that area and the area manager took it upon themselves to develop a bit of a file management protocol that included not only the necessary information for monitoring, but also other information that they felt was important to be included in the file. And they laid out, an approach or a method to capturing that information, whether it was captured electronically or through centralized filing.
And has that file management protocol done by the South Coast Area Office, have there been any discussions about trying to adopt that as a regional file management protocol?
There have been, and there has been some work done at the RHQ level to see about taking that and developing it into a more regional type of a document. The reality, though, is there are, different capacities amongst the areas in terms of that document management. So I can give an example. On South Coast, their protocol refers to particular files being stored on a shared drive that could just be linked to in Path. That capacity isn't necessarily the same in all of the areas. So you would have to have a somewhat different solution to that issue for some of the areas.
Who's responsible for improving file management within the Habitat Management Program?
It would be Dale Patterson's group, but I'm trying to think of what that support group, I think it would fall on the administration side, but I'm not sure exactly of the name.
Is it a national responsibility, a regional responsibility?
I know it's being worked on at the regional level. I suspect it's being worked on at the national level as well.
I understand that you are the supervisor of the PATH coordinator.
I am.
So if there were national initiatives underway, would you be made aware of those?
Yes, I would. Yes, and to be clear, there is continuously work being done on the PATH program. So there are continuous improvements that are occurring on that program. So it is evolving and improving. However, document management goes beyond just project documents. There's a lot of other documents that this department generates that would be included in that document management issue as well.
Have you read Section 6.1.1 of our PPR regarding information management?
I suspect I have since I read the document, but...
Do you recall do you have any reactions to our discussion in that document of information management challenges or file management challenges? It may be that you go over this with your council as well, but...
Well, maybe you could point the witness to it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. It's the PPR, and I'm starting at paragraph 213, which I'm sorry is around page 84, I believe. I think, in fact, we've covered some of this. If we could just, my question's more about the next page. There's a discussion in the PPR about the PATH database. Did you have any comments or clarifications or corrections to make to the discussion of the PATH database, having read this document?
No, I would concur with what's stated there. So.
There was a comment yesterday or the day before from Mr. LeBlanc about species-specific information in the PATH database, and my question is, can PATH be searched directly for species-specific information?
My understanding is that you can do keyword searches on some of the comment boxes and some of the fields within PATH. So if that information was included, I expect that you could do a search along those lines.
Okay, I think that's it on habitat, on information management and record management. Let me just quickly check here. a couple of questions about arrangements with the province on the habitat monitoring side. Ms. Reid was asked if the BC Canada Fish Habitat Management Agreement is defunct, and I'm going to ask you if the agreement has ever informed your habitat monitoring work.
I guess in terms of some of the principles within the agreement, we've made efforts to contact provincial agencies that we know do monitoring in various forms, and we have had conversations and meetings with them to look at integrating our monitoring. So I guess the spirit would be there. The specifics, I would have to say no.
How often would you have had cause to refer to it in the last 2.5 years?
Once or twice.
Are you aware of any joint DFO BC habitat management groups or joint committees that have a specific mandate around habitat monitoring?
Well, there's things like the SLIP program, where inventory work is being done. That is occurring in a number of places. There are a number of sort of area-based committees looking at compliance monitoring or monitoring that habitat staff in the various areas are party to, or could be party to. So there is some engagement. I would say sort of categorize it as more ad hoc.
Do you sit on any committees with the province of BC that look at collaborating on habitat monitoring?
No, though I have had meetings with the biomonitoring group out of what used to be Ministry of Environment, talking about for our next field season how we might collaborate.
And well, maybe I'll just leave it at that and turn to my very last area of questioning.
Sure.
And that's turning back to the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development's 2009 report, which is tab 22 of our binder there, if that assists, and exhibit 35.
Sure.
And now, of course, I don't have the document in front of me, sorry. Could I ask you to turn to ringtail page 16, and that's 16 at the bottom of the document as opposed to the real pagination. Now, actually, I think we've already covered this, so skipping ahead. There's a heading, there's little monitoring of compliance and evaluation of effectiveness halfway down the page on ringtail page 16. Mm-hmm. And the discussion continues. Have you had the chance to review this document and this discussion?
Yes, I have.
So turning to the recommendation that's made, which is at page 19. I'm going to just read the part of the recommendation, which is the last sentence in paragraph 1.41. The department should also determine whether the required mitigation measures and compensation are effective in meeting the no net loss principle. And my question is, does that language suggest that the no net loss principle is a performance standard to be met?
Well, I think as was mentioned yesterday, I think it was more of a goal that was outlined in the policy as opposed to a performance measure. I think, the no net loss principle, if you're talking about productive capacity, is a fairly difficult thing to measure dependent upon a number of things. I can think of performance measures that might be more easily measured and evaluated.
Just to make sure we're all clear about what is meant when we talk about performance measures, how does that differ from a goal? It's a way of achieving that goal, or? It
would be an indicator associated with how you were doing towards that goal.
Okay, thank you. Looking at DFO's response to that recommendation, in particular the last sentence of the first paragraph of the response, it says the department commits to fully implement the habitat compliance decision framework and report on the results of project monitoring activities by the 31st of March 2010 and annually thereafter. Has your unit submitted a report prior to March 31st, 2010 on the results of project monitoring?
My understanding is that the reporting done in relation to this would be gathered from data that's contained within the PATH system. So all of our results from the compliance monitoring were put into the PATH system, so that reporting would be done at a national level, and that they would be basing it upon the data that's included in the PATH system. So we didn't write the report per se, but we did provide data that would be utilized at the national level for development of that report.
And have you yourself seen that report that you're talking about? And do you know what its title is?
No, I have not.
Are you working, apart from simply reporting into PATH and expecting that the national headquarters are going to take out that data and report on it, are you, in Pacific Region and the HMU, working specifically on implementing that recommendation, that response in any way?
In terms of developing a regional report on our monitoring results?
Right.
Yes, we are currently working on a regional report, and to be honest, if I wasn't sitting here, that's what I would be working on right now.
We'll get you back to it as soon as we can.
Thank you.
And in that spirit, I think I have two last questions. One is page 25 of this document. And this is a fairly important recommendation, I think, in light of the habitat management hearings. The top of this page says habitat loss or gain is not being measured. The recommendation made at paragraph 1.74 is that Fisheries and Oceans Canada should develop habitat indicators to apply in ecosystems with significant human activity. DFO's response is that it accepts and agrees with that recommendation. Do we not have those indicators for salmon in Pacific Region already?
Under the WSP?
I'm asking you.
Yeah, under WSP, there have been a set of indicators that have been developed and have gone through a peer review process. So those indicators would be specific to salmon habitat in this region. So yes.
But those are not yet being used?
Are you asking, are they being used at a national level, or are they being...
No, I'm asking they're not being used. I'm asking you if they're being used by Pacific Region in monitoring habitat.
My understanding is from the work of the monitoring unit, we are not gathering that data currently.
And my apologies, I think I've asked you that question already.
Yep.
So my final question, unless you have anything else to say about how DFO in the Pacific Region is responding to that response and recommendation, out of fairness, is there any other thing that you're aware of that DFO here is doing?
I think it's key to point out that, we are implementing a monitoring program in this region. There are people actively out doing compliance monitoring now. We did conduct, I think, 614 compliance monitoring site visits this year. So monitoring is, at least compliance monitoring is being conducted, and we are working towards developing effectiveness and longer-term goals with regards to ecosystem health monitoring as well.
Thank you. My last question is simply whether you have any comments or corrections to make upon reading our policy and practice report, specifically with respect to habitat monitoring.
No, not right now, no.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hearing we now recess for 15 minutes.